My grandson brought home his fiancée. I recognized the ring from my late husband's first marriage. The night my grandson introduced me to his fiancée, I shook her hand, admired her dress, and then I saw the ring on her finger and forgot how to breathe. Not because it was beautiful, though it was. Because I had seen that exact ring in a photograph tucked in my dead husband's sock drawer for 52 years, on the hand of a woman who was not this one. Here's the part that still surprises people when I tell it. The worst thing that happened that night wasn't the ring at all. It was watching my grandson's future mother-in-law realize I'd recognized it, and decide, right there over the dinner rolls, to lie to my face about where it came from. My name is Eleanor Hargrove. I'm 73, and for 44 years I owned and ran Hargrove Fine Jewelers on Delancey Street, a narrow storefront with a green awning where I appraised, repaired, and occasionally rescued other people's heirlooms. I know stones the way some women know recipes. Hold a ring under my loupe for 10 seconds and I can tell you its age, its era, whether the setting has been reworked, and whether the person who commissioned it loved carefully or loved in a hurry. I can also tell you, 9 times out of 10, when a piece of jewelry is carrying a story it hasn't told yet. My hands still know the weight of a stone the second it drops into my palm. 44 years behind that counter taught me things about people that had nothing to do with carats. I tell you this so you understand what it meant when I looked down at a stranger's hand at my grandson's engagement dinner and every instinct I'd built over half a century stood straight up at once. Let me start where it really starts. With Walter. My husband Walter passed 4 years ago, quietly, in his sleep, the way he'd have wanted, after 41 years of marriage to me. But Walter had a marriage before mine. A short one. 3 years, to a young woman named Rosalind Doyle, whom everyone called Rose. Walter was 24 when he married her, in the spring of 1971. He was 27 when she died, in the winter of 1974, of a brain aneurysm that gave no warning at all. She was hanging laundry on a Tuesday morning and she was gone by lunch. Walter didn't speak of Rose often in the years I knew him. Grief like that doesn't get talked out of a person. It gets folded up small and carried. But he told me the outline, early, before we married, because he was an honest man and he wanted me to know what I was walking into. He told me about the wedding. About the sapphire ring he'd bought her, a cushion-cut Ceylon stone that had belonged to her grandmother, reset by Walter into a rose-gold Edwardian band, with 2 words engraved inside the shank so small you needed a loupe to read them, forever, W.H. And he told me what happened to that ring after Rose died, which was the part that never stopped costing him. In the week after the funeral, while Walter was too broken to get out of bed most days, Rose's older sister came to help sort the estate. Her name was Marlene Doyle. Marlene took the good silver. She took Rose's mother's cameo brooch. And she took the sapphire ring, right off the nightstand where Walter had set it the night before, still in its little velvet box, because he couldn't bear to see it on anyone's hand but hers, not yet, maybe not ever. When Walter finally asked for it back, weeks later, Marlene told him the ring was a Doyle family piece and belonged with the Doyles, not with a widower who'd remarry someday and give it to someone else. Walter was 27 years old, half out of his mind with grief, and he let it go. He spent the next 52 years regretting that. He filed a police report in 1975 that went nowhere. He checked pawnshops for a decade. He kept a photograph of Rose wearing that ring, and a copy of the original 1971 insurance appraisal, with a full description, the engraving, everything, in a folder in his sock drawer, in case it ever surfaced somewhere he could claim it back. If that ring ever turns up, Ellie, he told me once, near the end, when he was tired and honest in the way dying men get, don't make a fuss about it for my sake. I'm past needing it back. Just make sure the truth of it finally gets said out loud. Marlene spent 50 years letting people believe she was generous with what was never hers to keep. I promised him I would. I did not expect to be keeping that promise inside of 18 months, at my own grandson's engagement dinner, over a plate of roast chicken. My grandson Tyler is 28. He's my son David's boy, gentle and a little too eager to please, the kind of young man who apologizes to furniture when he bumps into it. Tyler had been dating a young woman named Brianna for about a year, and in June he called to tell me they were engaged and that he wanted us all to meet properly before the wedding planning started. "You'll love her, Grandma," he said. "She's smart. She's kind. Her family's a lot, but she's not like them." I remember thinking that was an odd thing for a happy man to say about his fiancée's family a week after proposing. I filed it away and didn't think much more of it. I hosted a small dinner. My son David and his wife came. Tyler came. And Brianna came, with her mother Denise and her grandmother Marlene, who I was told didn't get out much anymore but had insisted on being there. If you've ever had the strange experience of a name from an old story walking into your living room in the flesh, decades later, you'll understand what it did to me to hear, "This is my grandmother, Marlene," and realize I already knew exactly who that was. I shook her hand. She had no idea who I was. Why would she? I was just an old man's second wife she'd never met. But I knew her. And then Brianna took my hand to say hello, and the light from my dining room chandelier caught the stone on her left hand, and the whole room tilted very slightly under me. A cushion-cut sapphire. Deep cornflower blue. A rose gold band with an unmistakable Edwardian shoulder detail, the kind almost nobody sets anymore because it takes 3 times as long. I had appraised rings like that maybe a dozen times in 44 years. I had seen this exact one exactly once, in a photograph, on a dead woman's hand. "What a beautiful ring," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I felt. "Oh, thank you." Brianna beamed. "It's a family piece. My grandmother gave it to me for the engagement. It's been in her side of the family forever." I looked at Marlene. Marlene looked back at me with the polite, closed-off smile of a woman who has spent a very long time not being asked follow-up questions. I want to be fair to that moment, because I've turned it over 10,000 times since. I could have said something right there. I could have looked at this sweet, unsuspecting young woman and said, "That ring belonged to my husband's first wife, and your grandmother took it off a grieving man's nightstand." But I didn't know yet. Not for certain. A memory of a photograph is not proof. 50 years is a long time, and grief plays tricks, and I have appraised enough rings to know that 2 pieces can look nearly identical and still be entirely different objects. So I did the thing I'd trained myself to do for 44 years behind that counter. I said nothing, and I paid very close attention. If you've ever sat across a dinner table from someone and smiled while your whole mind was somewhere else entirely, running numbers, running years, running a face you hadn't thought about in decades, you know exactly the kind of evening I had. Stay with me. This is where it starts to unravel. I need to tell you about Marlene Voss, because she is more than a villain in this story, even if she is also that. Marlene grew up the older of 2 Doyle sisters in a family that didn't have much and lost what little it had twice, once in a bad crop year, once in a bad investment her father made. Rose was the pretty one, the easy one, the one people gravitated to. Marlene was the practical one, the one who held things together and rarely got thanked for it. When Rose died at 26, married to a young man with a good job and a house and a future, I think something in Marlene simply decided that was unfair. That grief and unfairness had earned her something. That taking a few things from a devastated 27-year-old wasn't stealing, it was collecting what the world owed her family. I don't say that to excuse her. I say it because Marlene has spent 52 years being, by all accounts, a doting grandmother and a church-going woman, and people who do one terrible, quiet thing in a moment of grief and get away with it clenched do not usually think of themselves as thieves. They think of themselves as people who were owed something. That's what makes them dangerous. They believe their own account of it. And her daughter Denise, Brianna's mother, grew up in that same account. Grew up understanding, without ever being told outright, that family means whoever's grieving hardest gets to decide what's fair. That taking is sometimes just claiming. I watched Denise across my dinner table that first night, and I recognized the same entitlement Marlene wore, just newer, glossier, dressed in a nicer blouse. "We're so glad Tyler found Brianna," Denise said at one point, patting her daughter's hand. Honestly, with everything going on with the wedding budget, it's such a relief that his family seems comfortable. We were hoping we could all sit down soon and talk about who's covering what. Nobody had mentioned money. We were 3 weeks into an engagement. David, my son, laughed it off the way he laughs everything off. "Oh, we'll figure it out," he said, and reached for the wine. Tyler shot me a look across the table. A small, apologetic look. A boy warning me, without words, that this had already been happening for a while and he hadn't known how to stop it. I filed that look away too. If you've ever watched your own child go quiet in a room where someone else's family was quietly rearranging the furniture of your family's future, you know the particular ache of that evening. Type "I see it" in the comments if you've been there, and stay with me, because it gets worse before it turns. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay awake next to the empty half of the bed and thought about a photograph in a folder in a drawer that, for years after Walter's death, I still hadn't been able to throw away. At 6 a.m. I got up and found it. Walter kept meticulous records. Jewelers usually marry other detail-oriented people, or become that way by osmosis, and his sock drawer folder had survived 3 moves and a house downsizing because I simply hadn't had the heart to sort through it. Inside, a black and white photograph of Rose Doyle Hargrove on her wedding day, laughing, her left hand raised to shade her eyes from the sun, a ring unmistakably visible on her finger. A carbon copy of an insurance appraisal, dated August 1971, from a jeweler named Aldo Renzetti, describing a cushion-cut salon sapphire, approximately 2.3 carats, set in 14-karat rose gold, Edwardian mounting with millgrain detailing, engraved interior band reading "Forever, W.H." And a copy of a 1975 police report Walter had filed, describing the ring as missing from the estate of his late wife, last seen in the possession of Marlene Doyle, no charges filed, insufficient evidence, case closed. I sat at my kitchen table with my reading glasses on and my hands, which do not shake for much anymore, shaking just slightly. It was possible I was wrong. It was possible some jeweler somewhere had made 2 nearly identical rings in the same era, and I was an old woman seeing ghosts where there were only coincidences. I have appraised thousands of rings. I know how rare that mounting style actually is. I know how rare a 2.3-carat unheated salon sapphire actually is. I know what the odds were. But I also know that a gemologist doesn't testify on a feeling. A gemologist testifies on evidence. So I decided to get some. The first call I made was to Aldo Renzetti's son, Marco, who'd taken over his father's shop 3 towns over before retiring himself a decade ago. Aldo had passed in the 90s, but Marco still had boxes of his father's old appraisal cards in a storage unit, the kind of meticulous paper trail 2 generations of careful jewelers leave behind. "Renzetti, 1971, Hargrove," I told him over the phone. "A sapphire, cushion-cut, Edwardian rose gold mount." It took Marco 4 days and a trip to that storage unit, but he found it. A handwritten card, in his father's hand, matching Walter's copy line for line, with a small pencil sketch of the setting in the margin the way old Aldo used to do for every important piece. That was the first piece of paper. The second thing I did was call Evelyn Marsh. Evelyn had been Rosa's maid of honor in 1971 and, strangely enough, had become a dear friend of mine years later, after Walter introduced us at a reunion he'd been nervous to attend alone. Evelyn was 74 now, sharp as ever, living 2 hours away in a condo full of houseplants. I asked her, carefully, whether she remembered the ring. "Of course I remember the ring," Evelyn said. "I was there when Walter proposed with it. Rose used to hold her hand up to the light in church just to watch it catch." "Why on earth are you asking me about that ring after 50 years, Ellie?" I told her. There was a long silence on the line. "Marlene," Evelyn said finally, in a voice gone flat and cold. "I always wondered. I was at the house the week after the funeral. I saw her carrying a box of things down to her car and Walter just standing there, gray as a sheet, not stopping her. I told myself it wasn't my business." "You should tell someone she took the good silver too, and the cameo brooch," Evelyn added. My mother always said Marlene Doyle could clear a room of anything that wasn't nailed down and still get invited to the next funeral. That was the second piece of evidence. Not paper this time. A living witness who had watched it happen and carried the guilt of her silence for half a century, same as Walter had carried his. If that sounds familiar to you, the guilt of watching something wrong happen and telling yourself it wasn't your business, you are not alone in that particular ache, and I want you to know it's never too late to finally say the thing out loud. Stay with me. Evelyn was about to get her chance. The third piece of evidence was the hardest to get, because it required Brianna's trust, and I did not want to burn that before I understood exactly what I was dealing with. 3 weeks after that first dinner, Brianna called me herself. Tyler says you used to own a jewelry shop, she said, a little shy. I was wondering, this ring is so old, and I've never had it properly cleaned or checked. Would you mind looking at it for me? I trust you so much more than some random mall jeweler. I want you to sit with the cruelty of coincidence for a moment, because I certainly did. This sweet, unsuspecting young woman was handing me, of her own free will, the exact object I needed to confirm everything, and she had no idea what she was carrying into my house. I'd be honored, I told her, and I meant it, though not for the reason she thought. She came over on a Thursday afternoon, slipped the ring off her finger, and set it in my palm like she was handing me something precious. She was. Just not for the reasons she knew. I took it into my workroom. I'd kept my old bench and my loop and my jeweler scale long after I'd closed the shop, because some habits don't retire even when you do, and I examined it the way I'd examined 10,000 rings before it. Cushion-cut sapphire. Deep cornflower blue, no visible heat treatment under magnification. Rose gold, Edwardian mounting, millgrain detailing along both shoulders exactly matching the pencil sketch on Aldo Renzetti's 1971 card. I turned the band to the light and looked inside the shank with my loupe. The engraving had worn soft with 50 years of handling, the way gold engraving does, but it was there. 2 words, faint as breath. Forever, W.H. I sat alone in my workroom for a long moment with my husband's first wife's ring in my hand, and I will tell you honestly, I cried a little. Not from anger. From the strange, small grief of holding something that had waited 52 years to be recognized by someone who finally knew what it was. Then I dried my eyes, cleaned the ring exactly as promised, and handed it back to Brianna with a smile. Beautiful piece, I told her. Whoever set that stone knew what they were doing. It's my grandmother's family ring, Brianna said again, sliding it back on. She said it's been passed down forever. I did not correct her. Not yet. I had one more thing to check first, because I have learned that people like Marlene rarely do a terrible thing exactly once, and I wanted to know precisely what I was walking into before I said a single word to my grandson's family. I called around. I still know people from 44 years in the trade, and small towns keep long memories where jewelry is concerned. What I learned took another 2 weeks to piece together, and it confirmed something I'd suspected the moment Evelyn used the word again without me prompting her. Marlene Voss had done this before. In 1988, a cousin on the Doyle side, a woman named Patricia Doyle Farr, lost her husband suddenly to a heart attack. Marlene had been the one to help with the funeral arrangements, and in the process, according to 2 separate people I spoke with who were still alive to remember it, several pieces of Patricia's mother-in-law's jewelry went missing from the house and were never seen again. Patricia had suspected Marlene for 36 years and never said a word, because Marlene was family, and because there was no proof, and because the pieces were, in the end, only things. Except they weren't only things. They never are. They're the last physical proof that somebody was loved by somebody else, and Marlene Voss had made a quiet habit, twice that I could document and probably more that I couldn't, of collecting other people's grief and calling it inheritance. I had a paper trail. I had a living witness from 1971. I had a second victim from 1988 who might finally be willing to speak. And I had the ring itself, cleaned, verified, sitting on an unsuspecting young woman's finger. 3 weeks from a wedding that Marlene's family was already trying to make my family pay for. I want to be honest about the temptation I felt in that moment. I could have called Marlene directly and let her have it. 52 years of Walter's quiet grief gave me every right to. But I thought about what he'd actually asked of me. Not vengeance. Just the truth, said out loud, where it could finally do some good instead of just sitting in a drawer rotting a good man's peace of mind for half a century. And I thought about Brianna, who I was becoming genuinely fond of, who was as innocent in all of this as Walter had been the day Marlene walked out of his house with a box of his dead wife's things. I was not going to let this family's oldest sin land on the youngest person in it. So I decided how, and where, and when I was going to make it right. I offered to host the engagement dinner, the real one, the formal one, with both families and the wedding planning finally on the table. Let me do it, I told Tyler. Your grandfather and I always hosted the big family dinners. It would mean a great deal to me. Tyler, who had no idea what was coming, hugged me and said it was a lovely idea. I invited David and his wife. I invited Tyler and Brianna. I invited Denise and Marlene. And, with Brianna's blessing, since I told her honestly that Evelyn had been dear friends with a member of my late husband's family and I thought she'd enjoy the evening, I invited Evelyn Marsh. I spent the week beforehand doing something I hadn't done in years. I got out my old loop on its chain, the one I wore behind the counter for 4 decades, and I polished it until it shone. I laid Walter's folder on my desk, the photograph, the appraisal, the police report, and I made 3 clean copies of everything, because I have learned that facts land better on paper than in the air. There was one evening, the night before, when I sat with all of it spread across my kitchen table and very nearly called the whole thing off. What if I was about to detonate my grandson's engagement over a 50-year-old grudge that wasn't even mine to carry? What if Brianna hated me for it? What if Tyler never forgave the family for making his fiancée's grandmother into a public villain 3 weeks before his wedding? I sat with that fear a long time. And then I looked at the photograph of Rose, 26 years old forever, laughing with her hand raised to the sun, and I thought about a young widower who never once got to hear the truth said out loud in his lifetime. I owed him this. And, though she didn't know it yet, I owed Brianna the truth even more than I owed Walter the vengeance. I put the loop around my neck the next evening at 5:45, an hour before anyone arrived, and I did not take it off again until it was over. They came at 7. I'd made a roast, the way I do for family, because you don't do the hard thing on an empty stomach, and I wanted no one accusing me later of ambush over an empty table. We ate. We talked about the venue Brianna and Tyler had booked, about flowers, about a guest list creeping toward 150 people that Denise kept describing as modest, considering. Denise brought up money twice during dinner. Once about the florist deposit. Once, more pointedly, about whether David and I had started thinking about our contribution, phrased exactly like that, as though it were a foregone conclusion rather than a request. David, predictably, said we'd talk about it. Tyler went a little pale and said nothing, the way he does. I let it all happen. I ate my roast. I waited. When the plates were cleared, I stood up, and I asked Brianna if I could see the ring one more time, just for a moment, in front of everyone. She smiled and slid it off, handed it to me without a second thought, the way you hand something to a person you trust. I put on my loop. I want to tell all of you a story, I said, about a ring. The table went quiet the way tables do when an old woman's voice changes register. This is a cushion-cut Ceylon sapphire, roughly 2.3 carats, set in 14-carat rose gold with an Edwardian Milgrain mounting, I said, turning it slowly under the dining room light. It was made, or rather reset, by a jeweler named Aldo Renzetti, in a shop that no longer exists, in August of 1971. I set the first piece of paper on the table. The appraisal card. This is Aldo Renzetti's original appraisal from that year. You'll notice the pencil sketch in the margin matches this ring setting exactly. Marlene's face had gone very still. My husband Walter commissioned this ring for his first wife, Rosalind Doyle, in the spring of 1971, I said. They married that June. I set down the second piece of paper. The photograph. This is Rosalind on her wedding day. If you look closely at her left hand, you can see the ring. Denise leaned forward despite herself. Brianna had gone completely silent, her eyes moving between the ring in my hand and the photograph on the table. Rosalind died in February of 1974. A brain aneurysm. She was 26 years old. I let that sit exactly as long as it needed to. In the week after her funeral, while my husband was too devastated to get out of bed most days, a family member came to help sort the estate. She left with the good silver, a cameo brooch that had belonged to Rosalind's mother, and this ring, taken from the nightstand where Walter had set it because he couldn't bear to see it worn by anyone else yet. I looked at Marlene. That family member was you, Marlene. The room did not laugh, the way rooms sometimes do at other kinds of unkindness. This room went absolutely silent. That's not, Marlene started, and her voice had the particular brittleness of someone reaching for an old story that has served her for 50 years and finding it doesn't quite fit anymore. That ring has been in our family. My mother gave it to me. Your mother, I said gently, was Rose and your mother too. And this ring was never your mother's to give. It was a gift from a groom to a bride in 1971, insured, appraised, and photographed. Here's the third piece of paper, Marlene. It's a police report Walter filed in 1975, naming you as the last known person in possession of it. I turned to the ring itself. And if anyone doubts a piece of paper can lie or a memory can be mistaken after 50 years, there's one thing paper can't fake. I handed the ring, and my loop, to Brianna. Look inside the band, sweetheart. Hold it right up to the light. Brianna's hands were shaking slightly as she took it. She found the engraving. I watched her mouth move as she read it, silent at first, then out loud, barely a whisper. Forever, W.H. She looked up at me. W.H., she said. Walter Hargrove. Walter Hargrove, I confirmed. My husband. Your fiancé's grandfather. He engraved that for a woman named Rosalind Doyle 55 years ago, and he spent the rest of his life wondering what happened to it. Evelyn spoke up then, for the first time all evening, and her voice was steady and clear in a way that told me she'd been waiting 50 years for the chance. I was Rosa's maid of honor, she said, looking directly at Marlene. I was at the house that week in 1974. I watched you carry a box down to your car while Walter stood in the doorway too broken to stop you. I never said anything, Marlene, because I told myself it wasn't my place. I was wrong. It was exactly my place, and I'm sorry it took me 50 years to say so. Denise's face had drained of all its earlier confidence. Mom, she said, quiet. Is this true? Marlene did what people like Marlene do when the account they've told themselves for decades finally meets daylight. She reached for the version where she was still the wronged one. I was grieving too, she said, her voice rising. Rose was my sister. My only sister. Everyone forgets that. I lost her too, and nobody thought about what I was owed, what I'd lost, watching my baby sister marry up into a family with money while I had nothing. That ring should have stayed with the Doyles. It was never really his to give away in the first place. It was a gift, Marlene, I said, and I kept my voice as gentle as I could manage, which somehow lands harder than shouting ever does. Gifts don't revert to the giver's family when the marriage ends in tragedy instead of divorce. And even if you believed that in your grief in 1974, you had 52 years afterward to say a single word about it. You chose instead to let a grieving widower believe he'd lost the last physical piece of his wife to simple bad luck, while you kept it in a drawer and eventually handed it to your granddaughter as though it were an honest inheritance. I looked at her fully then. And it wasn't only Rosa's things. Patricia Farr lost jewelry from her mother-in-law's estate the same way in 1988, the same week you were helping. I spoke with two people who remember it plainly. This isn't one bad week in grief, Marlene. It's a pattern with your name on it, 36 years apart. The table was dead silent. Denise had put her face in her hands. Tyler was staring at his grandmother-in-law-to-be like he was seeing an entirely different woman than the one who'd been charming him at every family dinner for a year. Brianna was still holding the ring, and the loop, and she was crying. "I didn't know," she said. "I swear to God I didn't know. She told me it was a Doyle family piece. I never once thought to ask deeper than that. I'm so sorry, Mrs. Hargrove. I'm so sorry." "You have nothing to apologize for," I told her, and I meant every word of it. "You were handed a story the way you were handed the ring. Neither one was yours to question until someone finally gave you the tools to." Tyler found his voice then, for the first time all evening, and it wasn't the voice of the boy who apologized to furniture. "Denise," he said, looking at his future mother-in-law, "you sat at my grandmother's table 3 weeks ago and asked her to help pay for a wedding funded partly by a ring your family stole from her husband. Did you know?" Denise didn't answer right away, and that silence answered for her. "I suspected," she finally said, very small. "I never let myself really look at it." "That's the family talent, isn't it?" Tyler said, not unkindly, but not softly either. "Not really looking at it. Here's what I want you to understand about that moment, because it's the hinge of everything that came after. I had a choice, same as always. I could have demanded the ring back on the spot, the way I had every legal and moral right to. Vengeance is available to old women. We've simply learned not to reach for it as often as we'd like to. But I looked at Brianna, sobbing quietly with my late husband's engraving in her palm, and I understood that punishing her for her grandmother's 50-year-old sin would only prove that this family's habit of making the wrong person pay ran in more than one direction. So I told them what I'd decided. The ring is going to stay with Brianna, I said, and here's why. Walter never wanted it back for the metal or the stone. He wanted the truth told. He told me so himself, near the end. That ring has now, finally, told its own truth, in this room, tonight, in front of everyone who needed to hear it." I looked at Brianna. "You didn't take anything from anyone, sweetheart. You're marrying into this family in 3 weeks with a ring that was made, 55 years ago, to mean forever. I think it's earned the chance to actually mean that this time, with the truth attached to it instead of a lie." Then I looked at Marlene. "But the silver, and the cameo brooch, and whatever Patricia Farr's family is still owed from 1988, that's a separate conversation, and it's one you and I are going to have privately, without an audience, because unlike you, I don't need a room full of witnesses to know I'm telling the truth." And then, because mercy and consequence can sit at the same table, I turned to Denise. "As for the wedding budget," I said, "my family will contribute what we always planned to contribute, gladly, because I love my grandson and I am fond of Brianna. But we will not be shamed or guilted into paying more because your family's version of generosity has always run one direction, toward yourselves." Nobody argued with the terms. There wasn't much left to argue. "Here's how it settled out in the months that followed, because I know you want the accounting and not just the feeling. Marlene and I did have that private conversation. She never fully apologized. Some people simply aren't built for it, the same way some metals won't hold certain shapes no matter how you work them, but she did, quietly and without ceremony, return the cameo brooch, which had been sitting in her jewelry box the entire time, and she wrote Patricia Farr a check that Patricia told me later was 50 years too late and worth every cent of the weight, just to finally hear the words. Denise and I are civil. Careful, the way you are with a person you've caught out once and forgiven conditionally." She stopped mentioning contributions and started simply asking, which I've noticed is a very different kind of sentence. "Tyler has changed the most, same as these things tend to go. He told me a few weeks later that he'd spent the whole engagement so far quietly absorbing his future in-laws' expectations because it was easier than pushing back, and that watching his grandmother lay 3 pieces of paper on a table and simply tell the truth, calmly, without raising her voice once, taught him more about backbone than 28 years of being told to have one." I kept thinking, why isn't she yelling, he told me. And then I realized. She didn't need to. The facts were doing all the yelling for her. Brianna and I have grown close in a way I didn't expect. She asked, a month after that dinner, if I'd teach her a little about gemology, so I actually know what I'm wearing, for once in my life. We spent an afternoon at my workbench with the loop between us, and she held the ring up to the light the way I imagine Rose once did in a church pew in 1971, watching it catch. "Forever, W.H., she said, tracing the engraving with one finger. "I want to have it re-engraved before the wedding. Add our initials underneath his. So it's not just his story anymore. It's ours too, built on top of it, not instead of it." I told her I thought that was exactly right. Evelyn and I still talk every week. She told me that speaking up that night, 50 years late, was the lightest her conscience had felt since 1974. "I should have said something when it happened," she told me. "But I've learned it's never actually too late to say the true thing. It's only too late to have said it sooner." The wedding is in 3 weeks. I'll be there in the front row, and Brianna will be walking down the aisle wearing a ring that spent 52 years being a secret and a wound, and is about to spend the rest of its life being neither. My hands are slower these days than they used to be behind that counter. But I can still hold a loop steady enough to read the truth off a piece of gold, and I've learned, at 73, that the truth doesn't actually need me to shout it. It just needs somewhere honest to land. Walter used to say a good setting doesn't fight the stone, it just holds it up to the light and lets it do the talking. I think, in the end, that's all I really did that night. I didn't take anything from anyone. I just held an old ring up to the light, in front of the people who needed to see it clearly, and let 52 years of silence finally say what it had been waiting to say all along. That the past doesn't stay buried just because everyone agreed not to look at it. That the smallest object in a room is sometimes the one telling the truest story. And that forever, if you're lucky, gets a second chance to mean exactly what it was supposed to mean the first time.